The silent collapse behind the dynasty. The rain comes down in sheets against the window of a Boston apartment on an evening in 1982, each droplet catching the amber glow of street lamps below, before sliding down the glass in rivulets that blur the city lights into watercolor abstractions. Inside, in a room lit only by a single table lamp that casts more shadow than illumination, Joan Kennedy sits in a chair that faces the window, watching the rain without really seeing it. She is 55 years old, though the years have not been kind in their marking. Her hands rest in her lap, perfectly still, the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from exhaustion so profound that even small movements feel impossible. On the table beside her sits a glass, crystal, expensive, the kind of thing that signals wealth and taste. It is empty now, though it has been filled and emptied several times already this evening. Her reflection in the rain-streaked window shows a woman who was once beautiful, who is still beautiful in the bone structure, in the elegant line of her profile, but who carries in her expression something that beauty cannot mask. It is a kind of absence, a vacancy that suggests the person who once inhabited this body has slowly, incrementally disappeared, leaving behind only the shell, the performance, the woman who was supposed to be the perfect Kennedy wife, but who could never quite manage the role. She does not think in coherent narratives anymore. Her thoughts come in fragments, flashes of memory that surface without warning and disappear just as quickly. A campaign event where she smiled until her face ached. Ted's voice on the phone, distant and distracted, explaining another absence. The taste of vodka in the morning, hidden in orange juice. The first drink of what would become an endless day of drinking. Her children's faces, worried, trying to reach someone who was no longer quite there. The Kennedy family does not talk about Joan much anymore. She is the embarrassment, the failure, the one who could not handle the pressure, who fell apart in ways that were too public to ignore, but too uncomfortable to address. She is the drunk Kennedy wife, reduced to tabloid headlines and whispered judgments, her story eclipsed by the more dramatic tragedies. The assassinations, the plane crashes, the scandals that made better copy than a woman slowly drowning in alcohol and loneliness. But she is still here, in this room, watching the rain, waiting for nothing because there is nothing left to wait for. The dynasty moved on without her. The Camelot myth has no place for the woman who couldn't keep up, who couldn't maintain the facade, who cracked under the pressure, and let the world see what was supposed to remain forever hidden. Tomorrow she might try again. Tomorrow she might call her children, might attend an AA meeting, might attempt another climb out of the hole that seems to have no bottom. Or tomorrow might look exactly like today. Another series of hours to be endured. Another night watching rain against glass. Another morning waking to the realization that she is still here, still breathing, still trapped in a life that stopped feeling like hers decades ago. The rain continues, the glass sits empty, and Joan Kennedy, who was supposed to be part of America's royal family, sits alone in the shadows, a ghost in her own life, forgotten by the myth that once claimed her. Before she was Joan Kennedy, before she was the broken wife of a senator, before she became the cautionary tale whispered about at cocktail parties, she was Virginia Joan Bennett, born in 1936 in Riverdale, New York, to a comfortable, educated, artistic family that valued culture and creativity in ways the Kennedys never would. Joan grew up surrounded by music. Her mother was a pianist, her father appreciated the arts, and Joan herself showed remarkable talent from an early age. She studied piano seriously, with the kind of dedication that suggests genuine passion rather than mere accomplishment. Music was not decoration in Joan's life. It was expression, communication, the way she made sense of emotions that were too complex for words. She attended Manhattanville College, a Catholic women's school, where she continued her music studies while also developing the social graces expected of young women of her class and era. She was beautiful, tall, blonde, elegant in a way that suggested European aristocracy rather than American wealth. But she was also quiet, thoughtful, more interested in Chopin and Mozart than in the social climbing that consumed many of her peers. She was, in other words, exactly the kind of woman who should never have married into the Kennedy family. She was too gentle for their competitiveness, too introspective for their constant performance, too authentic for a dynasty built on carefully constructed image. But in 1957, at a party, she met Ted Kennedy, and everything that followed stemmed from that meeting. Ted was charming. This cannot be overstated. The Kennedy charm was not accidental. It had been cultivated across generations, refined and weaponized, deployed with devastating effectiveness. Ted was handsome, funny, attentive in ways that made Joan feel seen, special, chosen. He was also a Kennedy, which in 1957 meant he was American royalty, part of a family that seemed touched by destiny. Joan fell in love, or perhaps more accurately, Joan fell in love with the version of Ted that he presented during courtship, the version that was romantic and attentive, that seemed genuinely interested in her music and her thoughts, that suggested he wanted a partner rather than simply a decorative wife. This version of Ted was real in the sense that he believed it himself in those moments, but it was not sustainable. It could not survive the machinery of Kennedy ambition, the demands of political life, the expectations of a family that viewed marriage as strategic positioning rather than emotional connection. They married in 1958. Joan wore white, smiled for photographs, promised to love and honor and cherish. She meant it. She believed in the sacrament of marriage, believed in partnership and commitment. She did not yet understand that in the Kennedy family, marriage was not primarily about love. It was about producing heirs, maintaining image, supporting the political ambitions of Kennedy men while asking nothing for yourself. Becoming a Kennedy wife in the late 1950s meant entering a world with very specific rules, most of them unwritten but absolutely enforced. You were to be beautiful but not attention-seeking, intelligent but not opinionated, present but not assertive. You existed to support your husband's career, to produce photogenic children, to smile at campaign events and host dinner parties and maintain the fiction that the Kennedy family was not just wealthy and powerful, but also warm and relatable. Joan tried. She genuinely tried to be the wife that the family expected. She attended campaign events with Ted as he prepared to run for Jack's Senate seat in Massachusetts. She smiled for cameras, shook hands with constituents, learned to deliver the kind of bland pleasantries that political wives are expected to master. She gave birth to 3 children, Cara in 1960, Ted Jr. in 1961, Patrick in 1967, and threw herself into motherhood with the same dedication she had once brought to music. But the performance was exhausting. Joan was naturally introverted, thoughtful, someone who needed quiet and solitude to recharge. The Kennedy world offered no quiet, no solitude, only constant exposure, constant judgment, constant awareness that you were being watched and measured and found wanting if you showed even a flicker of authentic emotion. Ted's political career took off. He won his Senate seat in 1962, becoming the youngest Kennedy brother in office after Jack's ascension to the presidency. The family expectations that had once rested on Joe Jr., then Jack, then Bobby, now fell partially on Ted. He was not the heir apparent. That role had died with Bobby, but he was still a Kennedy, still expected to achieve, still measured against brothers who had been martyred and thus perfected in death. And Joan was expected to support all of this without complaint, without visible struggle, without suggesting that being a Kennedy wife was anything other than privilege and joy. She attended event after event, always impeccably dressed, always smiling, always the perfect political spouse. But inside, she was beginning to fracture. The first signs were small: a drink before a difficult event to calm her nerves, another drink to get through a particularly tedious dinner, a third drink once she was home, alone, with the children asleep and Ted away on some political obligation. The drinking started as medication, a way to manage anxiety, to make the performance bearable. But slowly, imperceptibly, it transformed from solution to problem, from occasional relief to constant need. What destroyed Joan was not any single catastrophe, but rather the accumulation of small abandonments, small dismissals, small moments when she realized that her needs, her feelings, her very self were considered secondary to the Kennedy family's image and Ted's political ambitions. Ted was rarely home. This was presented as necessity. Senate business, constituent meetings, political obligations that could not be avoided. But even when he was home, he was not really present. His attention was always elsewhere, always on the next campaign, the next speech, the next strategic calculation. Joan existed in his peripheral vision, useful when needed for appearances, otherwise largely irrelevant to his life. The infidelities began early, or perhaps they had never stopped. Ted Kennedy's extramarital affairs were numerous, barely concealed, and apparently considered acceptable by Kennedy standards. The family's attitude seemed to be that powerful men had appetites, that these appetites could not be denied, and that wives were expected to tolerate them gracefully while maintaining public fiction of marital happiness. Joan was not equipped to tolerate this gracefully. She was not Rose Kennedy, who had learned to turn her emotional life off like a light switch, who could witness her husband's betrayals and simply redirect her energy toward religious devotion and rigid control of her children. Joan felt things. The betrayals hurt. Each affair was a wound, each whispered rumor, another piece of evidence that she was not enough, that she had failed at the fundamental task of keeping her husband interested. She tried to be better. She tried to be thinner, more glamorous, more interesting. She resumed her piano playing, hoping that perhaps her musical talent would make Ted see her as more than simply the woman who bore his children. But nothing worked. Ted's attention remained elsewhere, and the Kennedy family's attitude toward Joan shifted from welcoming to vaguely disappointed, as though her inability to manage the situation was a personal failing rather than a reasonable response to impossible circumstances. The drinking increased. Joan was no longer simply having a drink to calm nerves before events. She was drinking throughout the day, steadily, maintaining a level of intoxication that made the loneliness bearable, but that also made everything else increasingly difficult. She began missing events, canceling appearances, showing up to political functions visibly impaired. The Kennedy family response was not compassion, but damage control. Joan was an embarrassment. She was making the family look bad. She needed to get herself together, to stop drinking, to remember her obligations. But they offered no actual support, no acknowledgement that the circumstances of her life might be contributing to her collapse. They simply expected her to fix herself while changing nothing about the situation that was destroying her. On July 18, 1969, Ted Kennedy drove off a bridge on Chappaquiddick Island, leaving Mary Jo Kopechne to die in his submerged car while he waited 10 hours to report the accident. For Ted, this was the end of his presidential ambitions. For Joan, it was something else. Another betrayal, another lie, another moment when she realized that her husband's priorities had nothing to do with her or their family. The official story was that Ted had been giving Mary Jo a ride to catch a ferry, but everyone understood there were questions about why he took that road, about his intentions, about what really happened that night. Joan, who had already endured years of Ted's infidelities, now had to endure public speculation about whether her husband had been having an affair with a woman who died because he prioritized his own interests over calling for help. The Kennedy machinery expected Joan to stand by Ted, to appear at his side during his televised address, to demonstrate wifely loyalty that would help rehabilitate his image. And Joan did it. She stood beside him, wearing a neck brace that mirrored his, looking composed and supportive, playing the role of the devoted wife even as everything inside her screamed that this was wrong, that she was enabling something monstrous, that her presence was being used to help him escape accountability. After Chappaquiddick, whatever remained of Joan's emotional stability began to collapse in earnest. The drinking that had been problematic became uncontrollable. She was hospitalized multiple times, quietly, discreetly, the Kennedy family ensuring that news of her breakdowns was suppressed as much as possible. But suppression only worked so long. Eventually, the tabloids got hold of the story. Joan Kennedy was a drunk. Joan Kennedy was falling apart. Joan Kennedy could not handle being a Kennedy. The public judgment was brutal. Some people had sympathy. They could see that Joan was suffering, that the Kennedy life had extracted a terrible price from her. But many simply saw a weak woman who could not manage what other political wives managed, who was making excuses for behavior that reflected poorly on the family. The fact that Joan was ill, that alcoholism is a disease rather than a moral failing, that she was experiencing a breakdown under impossible pressure, these nuances were lost in the simple narrative of failure. By the early 1980s, Joan and Ted's marriage existed only as legal fiction. They lived separate lives, maintained separate residences, appeared together only when political necessity demanded it. But divorce was complicated for the Kennedys. The family was Catholic, and divorce carried stigma. More importantly, Ted still harbored political ambitions, and divorcing a woman who was publicly struggling with alcoholism looked callous, opportunistic. But in 1982, Ted finally filed for divorce. The official statements were bland, predictable, grown apart, remain friends, committed to their children. The reality was that Ted no longer needed the pretense of marriage. His presidential ambitions had been permanently damaged by Chappaquiddick. He could afford the political cost of divorce. For Joan, the divorce was both liberation and devastation. Liberation because she was finally free from the performance, from the constant obligation to pretend that her marriage was something it had never been. Devastation because the divorce formalized what she had feared for years, that she had failed, that she was not enough, that she had been discarded by the family that had once claimed her. The settlement gave Joan financial security but little else. She was no longer Joan Kennedy in any meaningful sense. She was Ted's ex-wife, a footnote in Kennedy history, a woman whose primary identity had been stripped away without anything substantial to replace it. She tried to rebuild. She attended rehabilitation programs, worked with therapists, attempted sobriety with the kind of determination that suggested she genuinely wanted to change. She had moments of clarity, periods of weeks or months when she was sober and functional and hopeful about the future. But the relapses always came. The pull of alcohol was too strong, the pain of her life too profound, the years of damage too deep to be healed through willpower alone. Her children, Kara, Ted Jr., and Patrick, tried to help. They loved their mother, understood that she was suffering, wanted to save her from the cycle of addiction and relapse that was consuming her. But they were also damaged by their childhood, by growing up in a household defined by their father's absences and their mother's drinking, by the weight of being Kennedy children expected to maintain family image, even as their family collapsed around them. In the decades after her divorce, Joan Kennedy slowly faded from public consciousness. She was no longer invited to major Kennedy family events. She was no longer part of the political machinery. She was simply Joan, living in Boston, struggling with alcoholism and depression, trying to construct some kind of life from the ruins of what had come before. The media occasionally revisited her story, usually in the context of Kennedy tragedies or retrospectives on the family dynasty. These pieces were rarely kind. They presented Joan as the weak link, the Kennedy wife who could not handle the pressure, the cautionary tale about what happens when ordinary people marry into extraordinary families and cannot adapt. But this narrative was cruel in its incompleteness. Joan had not failed because she was weak. She had failed because she was human. She had emotional needs that the Kennedy family could not or would not meet. She had a capacity for authentic feeling that made the constant performance of Kennedy life unbearable. She had expected marriage to provide partnership and emotional intimacy, and instead found herself trapped in a role that demanded constant self-negation. Her health declined. Decades of heavy drinking had taken their toll on her body and mind. She developed the kind of chronic health problems that accompany long-term alcoholism: liver damage, cognitive impairment, vulnerability to falls and injuries. By her 70s, she required assisted care, living in a facility where she could be monitored and supported. Her children visited when they could, but they had their own lives, their own struggles. Patrick particularly had inherited his mother's vulnerability to addiction, fighting his own battles with substance abuse while trying to help her with hers. The cycle of addiction, so often generational, had claimed another Kennedy, proving that the family's vulnerabilities were not limited to assassination and scandal, but included the quieter tragedy of self-destruction. What makes Joan Kennedy's story particularly poignant is how thoroughly she has been erased from the Kennedy mythology. When people think about Kennedy tragedies, they think about Dallas and Los Angeles, about plane crashes in Chappaquiddick. They think about dramatic public deaths, about lives cut short by violence or accident. They rarely think about Joan, whose tragedy was slower, quieter, less photogenic. But Joan's tragedy is no less significant than the others. In some ways, it is more revealing. The Kennedy curse, if such a thing exists, did not only claim lives through assassination and accident, it also claimed lives through the grinding pressure of being a Kennedy, through the impossible expectations and the emotional abandonment, and the requirement to maintain perfect image while your internal world collapsed. Joan was destroyed by the same forces that created the Kennedy dynasty: the relentless ambition, the subordination of individual needs to family goals, the belief that image mattered more than reality, the tolerance for cruelty as long as it served the larger purpose. She was collateral damage in the family's pursuit of power, a casualty whose suffering was considered acceptable as long as it remained hidden. The Kennedy family never took meaningful responsibility for what happened to Joan. They never acknowledged that the conditions of her life as Ted's wife had contributed to her alcoholism, that their demands and their indifference had played a role in her collapse. They simply distanced themselves, letting Joan fade into obscurity while they continued their political and philanthropic work, maintaining the Camelot myth while ignoring the woman who had been broken by it. What Joan Kennedy's life reveals, perhaps more clearly than any other Kennedy story, is the human cost of maintaining a dynasty built on image rather than substance. The Kennedys presented themselves to America as a perfect family, beautiful, accomplished, devoted to public service, living proof that wealth and power could be combined with grace and virtue. But this image required enormous sacrifices from the people who were expected to maintain it. Joan sacrificed her authentic self. She gave up her music, her introversion, her need for genuine emotional connection. She subordinated everything to the role of Kennedy wife, and when she could not sustain that subordination, when her humanity reasserted itself through addiction and breakdown, she was judged and abandoned rather than supported. The myth required her silence about Ted's infidelities, about the loneliness of her marriage, about the impossible pressure of constant performance. The myth required her to smile and wave and pretend that everything was fine even as she drowned in alcohol and depression. The myth required her erasure when she could no longer maintain the pretense. And the saddest part is that Joan internalized this judgment. She blamed herself for her failures rather than recognizing that the system itself was designed in ways that made her suffering almost inevitable. She spent decades believing that if she had just been stronger, more resilient, more like Rose Kennedy, she could have managed. She never quite grasped that the problem was not her weakness, but the impossibility of what was being asked of her. Joan Kennedy is still alive as of this writing, in her late 80s, living quietly in a care facility in Massachusetts. She is no longer a public figure. The media has moved on to newer Kennedy stories, newer scandals, newer tragedies. She has become, in the cruelest sense, irrelevant to the narrative that once consumed her. But her story deserves to be told, not as tabloid fodder, not as another example of Kennedy tragedy, but as a human story about what happens when a gentle, artistic, deeply feeling person gets caught in machinery designed to extract value while giving nothing back. Joan loved music. She loved her children. She wanted partnership and emotional intimacy from her marriage. These were not unreasonable desires. They were basic human needs. But in the Kennedy world, these needs were considered weaknesses, indulgences that could not be accommodated, evidence of insufficient strength or commitment. She was not perfect. Her alcoholism hurt people, particularly her children, who grew up in a household shadowed by their mother's addiction. Her inability to maintain the Kennedy wife performance created problems for Ted's political career. But these failures do not erase the fundamental injustice of what was done to her, the way she was used, then discarded, then blamed for her own destruction. The rain still falls on Boston windows. Somewhere, in a quiet room, Joan Kennedy continues her diminished life, surrounded by caretakers, visited occasionally by her children, remembered by almost no one beyond her immediate family. The Camelot myth has no place for her. She is the woman who could not handle it, the weak link, the failure. But perhaps she is something else too. Perhaps she is the truth that the myth could not accommodate, the human cost that had to be hidden, the reminder that behind every perfect image are people who are suffering, breaking, slowly disappearing under the weight of expectations that should never have been placed on them. If you had been Joan Kennedy, what would you have done differently? Would you have been strong enough to leave the marriage earlier, to walk away from the Kennedy name and all that came with it? Or would you, like Joan, have found yourself trapped by love and obligation and the difficulty of abandoning a role that had become your entire identity? And when we judge people like Joan, people who collapse under pressure that most of us will never face, do we judge them fairly, or do we judge them from a comfortable distance that allows us to believe we would have been stronger, more resilient, more capable of maintaining perfect performance while our internal world crumbled? Joan Kennedy's tragedy is not that she was weak. Her tragedy is that she was human in a world that demanded inhumanity, authentic in a family that required constant performance, vulnerable in a dynasty that punished vulnerability with erasure. What would you have done? And would it have been enough?